of a very powerful pattern in the science of sacred geometry. If you're familiar with sacred geometry, you know that this is called the seed of life, and it is an integral component of a greater pattern called the flower of life. If you are not familiar with sacred geometry, you simply know by looking at this, you sense, you feel that there's something important happening here. This is a very powerful resonant symbol that we have. Well, 1995 crop season has just completed. We just got the slides back. I haven't really shown them to many people. And the next image that I have is, for me, one of the most interesting in 1995. And what you're seeing here, many researchers believe that we're seeing a model of our solar system. Here's the sun in the center. And just beyond the sun, you see Mercury in the orbit of Mercury, Venus in the orbit of Venus, the orbit of Earth, and there's no Earth in this orbit. And then Mars in the orbit of Mars, and the asteroid belt in its orbit, and we're not seeing anything beyond that. To many researchers, they believe that this is saying something very similar to what many of the crop circle messages have said, and that is simply that there is a change unfolding upon the Earth, within the lives of the people upon the Earth. I do not necessarily believe that this means Earth is disappearing. I believe that Earth, as we have always known Earth, is going through a tremendous transition and will probably never look the same following the transition as it did before that. And not intending to suggest here in this slide that there will be no Earth at all. Simply not the same Earth as we've seen before. Well, we're seeing these glyphs appear in many places, but some actually very unexpected places. The next slide that I'll show you is a slide that came to us from a little town known as Shaughnessy. And in Shaughnessy, what we see is the caption on the picture here. It says, they'd been seen before in Shaughnessy, but Doreen was still unprepared for the eerie rug circles that she was seeing in her living room. So maybe they are appearing in some other places. I don't know. Of course, this is ridiculous. And it's not that far from a phenomenon that is actually happening right now. I have not seen crop circles in people's carpets. I have seen actual photographs of glyphs that are appearing in places where there are no crops, and they use whatever media is there. In the ice, frozen rivers, lakes, and streams throughout the winter months in the Northwest, in the Minneapolis, St. Paul area, and all through the American desert Southwest. We're seeing those. The glyphs are not etched into the top of the ice or into the bottom. They're actually embedded in the inner layers of the ice, and they don't really last long. And even beyond that, for the first time this last year, 1995, I saw a phenomenon in northern New Mexico on a sandbar in the Rio Grande River. This image that I'm going to show you was taken from a balloonist who was at about 2,300 feet above the surface of the Earth. He lost air in his balloon quickly and dropped to about 200 feet. He believed that he was going to crash. And at 200 feet, he looked down onto this sandbar, and it happened to be on the day of the solstice, very close to high noon. And what he saw was this. You can see this spiral. This is a very, very particular, very specific kind of spiral that you will see often in the petroglyphs of the Southwest, in the traditions of the Hopi, the Navajo, many of the other indigenous people of that time. The spiral of time, the spiral of life. And the interesting thing about this and this particular spiral is that it didn't last long. It was gone within just a few hours of this sandbar. The water receded, the glyph was exposed, and then the glyph disappeared and the water covered it up again. So we're seeing a phenomenon that, if it is not new, has not been recorded much over the last few hundred years. All these things are happening now within the last few years of the close of this cycle, the close of this decade, this grand cycle of experience that began nearly 200,000 years ago. Why? And what does it mean? What does it mean to you and I? Again, the continuity of the information and the context within which this information is offered are so important. One additional phenomenon that I'd like to speak about as we're moving into this information is something called the photon belt. There's a lot of information, a lot of books out now. People are talking about the photon belt. what it means to us, what it means to our lives as we're witnessing this this phenomenon for which we have no reference point. We've never seen this happen before. Essentially what the photon belt is, in 1961, an astronomer named Robert Stanley began to detect particles of light, increased numbers of these particles in the atmosphere of the Earth. They were called photons. And they've been measured since 1961, and they have continued to increase in density. So what's happening is we are moving into a band, if you will, of greater and greater density, greater and greater particles of light. Well, researchers now know that this band is a band that our solar system runs into, or actually passes through, once about every 26 to 27,000 years, somewhere right around in there, depending on which calendars we're looking at. And that it takes our solar system about 2,000 years for us to pass from one edge to the other of this band. And at the 1,000 year point, we are in the center of the band, the densest portion of the light that this band, that this photon belt has to offer. Now there are texts out there from their perspective that have offered a scenario that to some people appears frightening. There has been some concern about what it means to us, what it means to our lives as we pass into this photon belt. We're in the photon belt right now. And you're watching this video, and I'm able to record this video. Our material, our equipment is still functioning, and we're in this photon belt. What I believe is happening is that the interpretation of our time, when we actually reach the midpoint of the photon belt, that time coincides very closely with a point in history that the ancients called the shift of the ages. And as we go through our magnetic models and the models of base resonant frequency of the Earth, you will see what those parameters mean to our lives, and you'll see how those parameters timed synchronistically with the moving into the center of the photon belt, how they provide a very different and unique experience for us. I believe that this is a very healthy and a very natural process that we are moving into. Is a process not to be feared, to be welcomed, as this photon belt is offering to you and I a reference signal, a reference frequency of light. And that will make more sense, and we'll refer back to this as we move through this body of information. The ancient calendars, almost universally, the ancient calendars point to this decade, to this time in history, as being unique not only in human history, as we have known it for the last 200,000 years or so, to Earth history, to geologic history as well. Almost universally, the calendars, Chinese calendars, Tibetan calendars, the Mayan calendars, the Egyptian calendars, that were developed thousands of years ago end in these days. They end in this time, and they all point to now as being a time that is very unique in history. This is an image of, it's taken from the wall of the Temple of Dendara in Egypt. And I know from where you are, it may not be clear what this image is. I'll give you a schematic next. I'll show you a schematic drawing so you can actually see what we're looking at. This is the original zodiac calendar from this temple wall. This is where the original patterns of the zodiac come from. This calendar, this Egyptian calendar, began nearly 39,000 years ago. Now, 39,000 years ago, this calendar was developed, and it ends now, in these days. The Mayan calendar, by some estimates over 18,000 years old, points to now, to this time in history. Jose Arguelles, in his book, The Mayan Factor, suspected that Mayan calendar measures something much more than time, in addition to the passing of linear time.